the omen of birth and the cradle of chaos. What becomes of a soul when the first sound he hears is not lullabies, but whispers of fear? In the gilded halls of the Château de Fontainebleau, beneath frescoed ceilings painted with divine victories, and corridors echoing with the footsteps of servants, a child was born on June 27, 1550. He was not born into obscurity. He was not destined for peace. His name was Charles of Valois, a prince of France. Yet even in that moment of birth, the omens hung heavy. Storm battered the French countryside that night, lightning illuminating the palace's golden arches, thunder rolling like a war drum, announcing the arrival of a boy who would never know stillness. France itself was no cradle of comfort. By mid-16th century, it was a haunted land, carved by suspicion and bleeding from wounds of faith. Catholic and Protestant, once neighbors, were now enemies, divided by a Bible interpreted in different tongues. Priests and preachers sharpened sermons like daggers, and across the towns of France, suspicion burned hotter than church candles. A nation torn at the altar, with every prayer stained in blood. Into this crucible of splintered faith and sharpened ambition, Charles opened his eyes. His lineage promised greatness. He was the fifth son of King Henry II and the formidable Catherine, the Medici queen, forged in the furnace of Renaissance politics. To the world, Catherine was a mother, but history remembers her as more widow, survivor, power broker, and above all, an architect of destiny. She was a woman who mixed prayer with poison, who trusted both rosary beads and the predictions of her astrologer, Nostradamus. The courts of Europe whispered of her as both saintly mother and shadowed sorceress. A woman who had seen too much loss to ever leave anything to chance. Charles was never supposed to wear the crown. The Valois line had no shortage of sons. His elder brothers were expected to rule, while Charles could live in the margins of privilege. A prince without the crushing weight of kingship. But fate has a habit of tearing through dynasties like wildfire. One by one, his brothers fell. Francis II, sickly and short-lived. Others, taken by disease or weakness. The cruel lottery of royal birth. The glittering future of France narrowed, until the burden fell on the narrow shoulders of a boy who could barely lift a sword. By the age of 10, Charles was staring down the unimaginable. A throne soaked in blood and burden was waiting for him. When his brother Francis II died suddenly in 1560, his death whispered to be suspicious. Though officially ascribed to illness, the crown slid not onto a man's head, but a child's. Charles was named King of France. Yet those who saw the coronation understood the truth. It was not Charles who ruled, but his mother. Catherine stood behind the throne like a sculptor at her clay, whispering instructions, shaping France through the fragile vessel of her son. Charles himself was delicate, pale, intelligent, but his smile was uncertain, and his hands trembled when he lifted them in greeting. Observers noted a strangeness in him even from youth. He was easily agitated, prone to silence one moment and sudden bursts of nervous laughter the next. His one true passion was hunting. At first, it seemed natural for a boy of noble blood. Yet, Charles did not hunt like others. He slaughtered compulsively deer, boar, foxes, even small birds, dozens in a single outing. He would return bloodied, his clothes stained, his face lit with a manic grin. It wasn't sport, it was something else. As though he hunted not to kill animals, but to drown out voices only he could hear, to chase away something, or perhaps chase after it. This was a child unraveling before the eyes of a kingdom already unraveling itself. France in 1560 was no longer whole. The Huguenots, France's Protestants, cried for freedom to worship. Catholics demanded retribution. Nobles sharpened their ambitions. Kays starved in the fields, muttering prayers to whichever god might listen. The monarchy, meant to be the glue that held the realm together, was itself fraying. And in the center of it all sat a boy king with hollow eyes, guided by a mother who believed more in omens than in mercy. Historians often debate whether Charles was truly cursed by madness, if he was simply a boy, broken under impossible pressures. Even in his earliest days, witnesses felt something uncanny about him. Some said he spoke to shadows in empty rooms. Others that he scribbled unsettling drawings in the margins of his school books, sketches of fire, of rivers filled with crimson, of figures without faces. Servants whispered that his sleep was haunted by screams, that he woke drenched in sweat, whispering that the walls bled. Catherine dismissed such rumors, or perhaps encouraged them after all. A king cloaked in mystery was harder to challenge. The boy's fragile mind would not be shielded from the storm raging outside the palace. Across the land, massacres and riots flared, Catholic mobs burning Protestant homes, Protestant militias storming Catholic villages. France was no longer one kingdom, was a chessboard of factions, each demanding blood. And above it all sat Charles, a king in name, a child in truth, the heir to a dynasty wrapped in velvet but drenched in paranoia. This was not the making of a monarch. This was the making of a tragedy. And though no one could know it yet, the day Charles was crowned was the day France began its descent into a nightmare that would stain its memory for centuries. The boy king and his mother's shadow, the crown of France, was never meant for Charles. He was a spare prince, a thread in a tapestry woven with stronger heirs. But fate is cruel, and in 1560 it pulled that thread until the whole fabric threatened to unravel. Francis II, Charles's older brother and king, collapsed after only 17 months on the throne. Officially, illness was to blame, but whispers slithered through the corridors of Paris poison plots, divine punishment. Whatever the truth, Francis's death left a vacancy too vast to ignore. And so, at just 10 years old, Charles IX became king. But the boy wore his crown like a costume. The velvet, the gold, the jewels, all of it, seemed to hang from him like borrowed robes. The power belonged not to Charles, but to his mother, Catherine de' Medici. To some, she was a savior, the only figure capable of holding France together. To others, she was a serpent, weaving plots in the shadows, her smile hiding daggers. In truth, she was both. She ruled not from a throne, but from behind it, whispering into her son's ear as though molding clay into a figure that could withstand the storms of France. Catherine had endured more than most rulers ever could. Born into the turbulent world of Renaissance Italy, orphaned as a child, pawned in marriage to King Henry II, she was dismissed by the French court as a foreign intruder. When Henry died in a joust in 1559, Catherine transformed from neglected queen to power broker. She understood that survival depended on more than swords. She leaned on astrologers, interpreting the stars for signs of France's fate. She surrounded herself with alchemists and apothecaries. Rumors said she kept poison hidden in hollowed-out books, in gemstone rings, even in rosaries. Whether true or not, the whispers gave her a terrifying aura, exactly what she wanted. Her loyalty was to one thing only, the Valois dynasty. Every decision, every manipulation, every scheme was in service of keeping her sons on the throne. And now, Charles was her vessel. The young king was bright, but fragile. Observers noticed how quickly his moods shifted, one moment laughing, the next trembling or staring into the distance, as though listening to voices others could not hear. Unlike his older brother Francis, who had been sickly and passive, Charles was restless, a boy who seemed desperate to escape the suffocating air of court, and he found his escape in the hunt. At first, it seemed harmless, even admirable. Hunting was the pastime of kings, a way to display vitality and courage. But Charles hunted with a compulsion that unsettled those who watched him. He killed endlessly, as though driven by something darker than sport. Deer, boar, birds slaughtered by the dozens. He would ride back to the palace with blood on his clothes. His face flushed with exhilaration, his eyes burning with something almost feverish. Servants whispered that the hunts were not about animals at all, but about silencing something that chased him from within. At court, Charles was less confident. He stammered during councils. His hands shook when he signed decrees. The boy, who should have been learning how to rule, was instead learning how to survive his lessons, not in leadership, but in paranoia. Catherine kept him under her watchful gaze, dosing him with strange concoctions meant to calm his nerves. Some believed she was slowly poisoning him to keep him weak, ensuring he would never break free of her grasp. Others thought she truly believed in the remedies: opium to soothe his restless mind, mercury to cleanse his humors, astrology to guide his every step. And yet, the child king tried. In the early years of his reign, Charles showed glimmers of hope. He listened carefully in council. He signed treaties aimed at bridging the gap between Catholics and Protestants. He even spoke publicly of peace. For a brief moment, France believed it might heal under the young monarch, but peace is fragile. And France was already a tinderbox. Every treaty seemed to fall apart as quickly as it was signed. Every attempt at unity only deepened the divides. The Catholics accused Charles of being too soft on the Protestants, accused him of being a puppet of Rome, and through it all, Catherine whispered in his ear, guiding him not toward reconciliation, but toward survival for herself, for her dynasty, and perhaps, least of all, for Charles. The boy was unraveling in plain sight. He retreated into himself, plagued by nightmares he called black dreams. Flames, rivers of blood, screams echoing in the distance. Sometimes he confessed them aloud, shuddering as though he'd already witnessed his own future, Spermus claimed. He hid in closets, sobbed before strangers, or flew into sudden rages. This was not the portrait of a king in control, but of a child drowning in forces far greater than himself, and France could feel it. Nobles whispered that the monarchy itself was cursed. Commoners muttered that God had abandoned them, that their king was marked by evil. But the truth was more complicated and more tragic. Charles was not evil, not yet. He was fragile, haunted, terrified, a boy whose crown was too heavy, whose destiny was written not by his own hand, but by the mother, who had crafted him into a vessel for her ambition. France needed a king. What it had instead was a shadow. The fractured kingdom, blood, faith, and fire. France was not merely divided in the 1560s, it was bleeding. Across the kingdom, towns smoldered from riots, villages emptied by raids, churches blackened by fire. Catholics and Huguenots, once bound by shared soil, now eyed each other across the pews with hatred sharpened to a knife's edge. Neighbors became enemies. Prayer in the wrong tongue could mark you for death. Charles IX inherited not a throne of stability, but a throne of fractures. His youth was no shield against the reality pressing in from every side. The wars of religion had already begun to carve France apart, and each faction demanded something from the boy who wore the crown. The Huguenots cried for freedom of worship, pointing to Geneva and the Protestant states of Germany as examples. The Catholics demanded retribution, insisting France must remain the eldest daughter of the Church, unsullied by heresy. The nobles, never blind to opportunity, sought power amid the chaos. And the peasants, those whose hands tilled the soil, and whose bellies, when empty, wanted only bread and peace. Though neither seemed within reach, at first, Charles tried to be a king of reconciliation. He held councils. He listened to pleas. Treaties were drafted and signed, proclaiming fragile promises of tolerance. The Edict of Angbuis, the Peace of Longjumeau, words etched in ink that melted as soon as the next skirmish broke out. France was already too far gone for paper to heal it. Trust had bled away into the earth alongside the bodies of neighbors, priests, and soldiers. Charles was just a boy. But even a boy could sense the futility. His pale face grew more hollow with each broken truce. He would smile awkwardly during councils, then retreat to his chambers, trembling, confessing to courtiers that his dreams were filled with rivers running red. He called them black dreams, flames licking the walls, screams tearing the silence, blood rising like floodwaters. Some believed he was cursed. Others whispered that Catherine was feeding him poison's opium to cloud his mind, keeping his body, keeping him pliable, keeping him dependent. Whatever the truth, the boy's grip on sanity seemed to slip. He lashed out unpredictably at courtiers. He accused servants of treachery, only to weep and beg forgiveness the next hour. At times, he locked himself away, refusing to eat, muttering prayers in half-remembered Latin. The court, already suffocated by suspicion, began to fear not just civil war, but the mind of their king. And yet, outside the palace walls, the war raged on. French streets were painted with sectarian slogans. Huguenot preachers stirred crowds to defiance. Catholic mobs answered with stones. In some towns, bells rang not for mass, but as signals to riot. France was a kingdom devouring itself, and its ruler was too fragile to command it. But fragility did not mean he was blind. Charles saw the cracks in his country, and they terrified him, could not escape them even in sleep. Servants reported hearing him cry out in the night, calling for help against enemies unseen. By 13, he looked less like a monarch than a haunted child in a costume of velvet and gold. Meanwhile, Catherine moved through the corridors like a shadow, her rosary clicking softly as she whispered prayers. Prayers, not for her son's peace, but for her dynasty's survival. She summoned astrologers to chart the stars for signs. She consulted apothecaries for remedies, some medicinal, others suspiciously close to poison. She ruled in her son's name, sculpting him as a figure of authority, while behind the veil of ritual and ceremony, she wielded true power. Still, the rumors clung to Charles like cobwebs, that he was bewitched, that he was poisoned, that he was already mad. Whether the whispers were true or not, they shaped how France saw its king, not as a savior, but as a fragile soul cracking under the weight of his crown. And in a sense, the whispers were right. The boy was unraveling. His hands trembled more. His laughter turned sudden, manic. His hunting trips became more frenzied, more desperate, as though killing beasts could exorcise the darkness within him. But nothing changed. The black dreams returned. The wars dragged on. France grew sicker, and Charles, still so young, grew sick with it. This was the moment when history tilted. A kingdom drowning in fire and faith, held together by a boy whose spirit was already splitting. No treaty, no prayer, no mother's ambition could keep the fractures from widening. The storm was building, and when it finally broke, France would remember the blood for centuries. The wedding that opened the gates of hell by 1572, France was exhausted. Years of religious war had carved scars across its body, and the people longed for an end to the slaughter. Catherine de' Medici, ever the strategist, believed she had found a solution not on the battlefield, but at the altar. If bloodshed had failed, perhaps a wedding could succeed where swords had not. Her plan was audacious. Her daughter, Margaret of Valois, would marry Henry of Navarre, the leading Protestant prince of France. It was more than a union of two people. It was meant to be the stitching together of two broken halves of a kingdom. Catholics and Protestants would share not just a feast, but a family. Hope, fragile as spun glass, flickered across Paris. The preparations were grand. Paris dressed itself in celebration. Bells tolled from every church tower. their chimes mixing with the laughter of noble guests arriving from across France. Tapestries were unfurled, streets lined with banners, and music filled the air. To foreign visitors, it looked like peace had finally been found. Perhaps France would step back from the edge, but beneath the glitter of pageantry, knives were being sharpened. Catherine's plan, though clever, was perilous. Many Catholics despised the match. Baptiste saw Henry of Navarre as a heretic intruding upon the sanctity of the royal bloodline. The powerful Guy's family, fierce champions of Catholic orthodoxy, seethed with fury. For them, compromise was betrayal, and peace could only be written in Protestant blood. The Huguenots, meanwhile, eyed the wedding with suspicion. Could Catherine, the very queen they accused of orchestrating plots against them, be trusted? And at the heart of it all stood Charles IX, 22 years old, yet worn down to a husk. The years of tension, of nightmares and broken truces, had hollowed him. He walked the halls of the Louvre like a ghost, his body gaunt, his eyes ringed with shadows. He wanted silence, not ceremony. But silence was impossible when his mind itself was a battlefield. Those closest to him whispered that he spoke to mirrors, holding conversations with reflections that offered no reply. This claimed he saw apparitions in empty corridors, figures that vanished when servants turned their heads. He muttered of voices louder than any court musician, voices that would not let him rest. The wedding festivities swirled on, dazzling on the surface, but every guest could sense the unease beneath. Protestants and Catholics dined together, exchanged smiles, even raised cups of wine to toast the union, but their eyes betrayed mistrust. In the back rooms of Paris, secret councils were held. Should the Protestants be allowed to remain? Should they be purged before they grew too bold? Catherine herself seemed restless, watching both her new son-in-law and her fragile son with equal suspicion. Feared the Protestant faction's influence on Charles, feared losing her grip on him. Henry of Navarre, though only 19, carried himself with a confidence that Charles lacked. He was shrewd, pragmatic, and most dangerously for Catherine beloved by many Huguenots who saw him as their champion. His marriage to Margaret placed him at the very doorstep of royal power. Catherine and the Catholic hardliners. This was not reconciliation. This was infiltration. And Charles, caught in the center, seemed unable to choose between his fears and his responsibilities. He laughed too loudly at the wedding banquet, as though trying to drown out the storm inside him. He drank heavily, his trembling hands clutching his goblets so tightly that red wine spilled like blood across the tablecloth. Guests smiled, but unease rippled through the room. For one moment, it seemed as though France might breathe again. Two enemies, bound in holy matrimony, might force their followers to sheath their blades. But that moment was an illusion, fragile and doomed, because in Paris, even as the bells rang in celebration, other bells waited to toll. They would not sing of union. They would scream of murder. The cursed wedding had opened the gates of hell, and when they swung wide, France would drown in blood. The night of St. Bartholomew, wedding that was meant to heal France, instead became the spark that set it ablaze in the days after the ceremony. Tension clung to Paris like smoke. Thousands of Protestant nobles had flooded the city to celebrate Henry of Navarre's marriage, filling its narrow streets with their presence. Two Catholic hardliners, it was an invasion heretics gathering under the shadow of Notre Dame itself. Every sermon rang with warnings. Every tavern buzzed with whispers of conspiracy. Then, on August 22nd, 1572, the fragile illusion of peace shattered. An attempt was made on the life of Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, the most respected Protestant leader in France. A shot from an arquebus tore into him as he walked home. He survived, but barely. The Huguenots. The message was clear. This was no accident. Someone wanted their leader silenced. The city trembled. Protestants demanded justice. Catholics feigned innocence. Charles IX, already frayed, already haunted, was thrust into the eye of the storm. Coligny, bleeding and bedridden, pleaded with the king for protection. Charles swore it. He promised safety, peace, order. But his words were brittle, his voice unsteady. Everyone could see it. The king's will was crumbling, and Catherine saw it too. Her Coligny was not just a Protestant leader. He was a dangerous influence over her son. Charles admired him, leaned on him, listened to him. In Coligny, Catherine saw her worst fear, that Charles might slip from her grasp and tilt toward Protestantism. To Catherine, that was not only betrayal, it was the unraveling of France itself. So, in the shadowed chambers of the Louvre, a decision was made. The Protestants had to be struck down decisively before they struck first. It was not framed as slaughter, but as survival. Cut off the head of the serpent, they whispered. Kill Coligny, kill the leaders. The rest would scatter. France would be safe. The crown would endure, but the serpent could not be killed with a single stroke. On the night of August 23rd, the bells of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois tolled not for mass, but for death. The signal had been given. The streets erupted in violence. Catholic militias, armed with pikes, swords, and torches, flooded Paris. They surged into Protestant quarters, dragging men, women, and children from their homes. Doors were broken. Screams tore the night. Blood spilled onto cobblestones. Nobles were butchered in their beds, their bodies thrown from windows. Women were cut down alongside children. The Seine ran red as corpses were hurled into its waters. This was no battle. It was a purge. Admiral Coligny, still wounded, was slaughtered in his chamber, his body defiled and tossed into the street. Protestants who had come to Paris to celebrate a wedding found themselves hunted in a nightmare instead. The massacre spread like wildfire from the Louvre to every district of the city. For 3 days, Paris drowned in blood, and at the center of it all sat Charles IX. Some say he ordered it, that he cried out in a moment of madness, killed them all, so that none remain to reproach me. Others argue he was manipulated, his will bent by Catherine and the Guise faction, until he could do nothing but nod. Perhaps both are true. What is certain is that Charles watched as the slaughter unfolded, his eyes wide, his body trembling. Courtiers whispered that he paced the halls like a man possessed, muttering to himself, clutching his head as though trying to block out the screams rising from the streets below. But the screams could not be blocked out, not for him, not for France. When the killing finally ceased, thousands lay dead in Paris. Across France, violence spread to the provinces: Orleans, Lyon, Bordeaux, Rouen, city echoing the massacre of St. Bartholomew's Day. Tens of thousands of Protestants perished in the weeks that followed, the wedding that was meant to unite. France had instead baptized it in blood, and Charles, the boy king, would never recover. He had wanted peace, or at least the illusion of it. What he carried now was the guilt of a slaughter so vast that history itself would not forget. The crown on his head had turned into a crown of thorns, and every thorn pierced deeper into his already fragile mind. From that night onward, the black dreams no longer waited for sleep. They haunted him in daylight. He heard the screams in the wind, saw blood in the shadows of his chambers. Some nights, he woke convinced he could still smell the iron sting of corpses in the Seine. And perhaps he could. The King of France had become the prisoner of his own nightmare. The Mad King's descent upon Bartholomew's night never stopped ringing in Charles IX's mind. Though the streets of Paris eventually quieted, the echoes of slaughter pursued him into every chamber, every silence, every dream. In The weeks after the massacre, the king moved like a man chased by shadows. His eyes darted constantly as if specters trailed him. He laughed too loudly at banquets, the sound brittle and sharp, before collapsing into fits of weeping. Servants whispered that he spoke to invisible companions, arguing with voices that only he could hear. The court saw not majesty, but unraveling. Charles became obsessed with the blood that had been shed. He confessed to his physician that he could still hear the screams of Protestants carried on the wind. He wandered the corridors at night, pale and trembling, claiming he saw pools of blood seeping from beneath the doors. "It follows me," he muttered to his attendants. "The blood, it clings to me." Cunting. Once his joy became fevered and grotesque. He killed with a violence that terrified even hardened soldiers. He would tear at the animals after they fell, his hands slick with gore, muttering, "More, more, let them all die." Some believed he was exercising his guilt. Others believed he was feeding it. His body, like his mind, began to collapse. He coughed constantly, his handkerchiefs stained with blood. His skin turned ashen, his frame skeletal. Tuberculosis gnawed at him, but the courtiers whispered of Poison Catherine's poison, the slow venom of a mother who needed her son only so long as he could serve her power. And yet, in the midst of his torment, moments of clarity broke through, moments that revealed the crushing weight of his conscience. In one of his final lucid confessions, Charles admitted to his nurse, tears streaking his face, "What evil counsel have I followed? God, forgive me. I am lost. What shall I do? I am lost forever." By 1574, at just 23 years old, Charles IX was no longer king, but a pale, haunted wraith. His lungs filled with blood, his nights filled with screams. He wasted away in agony, spitting crimson onto the floors of the Louvre, the walls echoing with his fits of coughing. His attendants swore that on some nights he whispered to the darkness, as though pleading with the dead for forgiveness. On May 30th, 1574, death finally claimed him. He died, shrieking, blood gushing from his mouth, his body racked with spasms. Those present swore. His eyes rolled back in terror, as though he saw once more the massacres he had unleashed. Charles IX's reign had lasted barely 14 years. He had inherited a kingdom torn by faith and left it drenched in more blood than ever before. His life was the story of a boy forced into a crown too heavy for his fragile mind, a boy who dreamed of peace, but who became instead the unwilling herald of one of history's most infamous massacres. France mourned little. Some saw his death as divine punishment, others as a mercy. His younger brother, Henry III, would inherit the throne and, with it, the poisoned legacy of the wars of religion. But for Charles, there was no inheritance, no peace, only the memory of bells tolling in the Paris night, and the screams that had never left him. The boy king had become the mad king, and in the end, the mad king became the damned king. The last Valois Charles X was barely in his grave when the shadow of Saint Bartholomew still clung to France. His brother, Henry of Anjou, turned from the Polish throne he had briefly worn and was crowned Henry III of France in 1574. He was the last hope of the Valois line, but in truth, the dynasty was already dying. The blood Charles had spilled stained not just his hands, but the very crown itself. Henry was no ordinary monarch. Where Charles had been fragile and haunted, Henry was strange, enigmatic, and deeply theatrical. He loved ceremony, processions, and masks. He wore jewels and perfumes, surrounded himself with a band of young, painted favorites whom the people mocked as les mignons. His devotion to ritual was obsessive processions of penitence, long nights of prayer, pilgrimages, barefoot, through the streets of Paris, scourging himself until his skin ran red. To some, he was pious. To others, unhinged. But if Henry had eccentricities, he also had the same curse. He inherited a kingdom in flames. The wars of religion did not die with Charles. The massacre of St. Bartholomew had not crushed the Huguenots, it had hardened them. Across the south of France, Protestant strongholds dug in deeper. Leaders like Henry of Navarre, who had narrowly survived the wedding-turned slaughter by renouncing his faith in Paris, emerged as symbols of resilience. At the same time, the Catholic cause radicalized. The Guise family, who had once whispered in Charles's ear, now openly challenged royal authority. They founded the Catholic League, a militant movement dedicated to eradicating Protestantism entirely. The League was powerful, fueled by zeal and foreign gold, and it treated Henry III not as a king, but as a puppet who must bend to their will. Thus, France entered its most chaotic chapter, the War of the Three Henrys. Henry III, king, caught in weakness and indecision. Henry of Guise, the warrior prince of Catholic fanaticism. Henry of Navarre, the Protestant claimant, whose bloodline gave him a path to the throne itself. Each Henry claimed legitimacy. Each commanded armies. Each believed God favored his cause, and the kingdom itself became the battleground upon which their rivalries tore apart what little order remained. Henry III, like Charles before him, was too fragile for the storm. He vacillated, signed treaties he could not enforce, betrayed allies. He needed alienated supporters he could not afford to lose. He retreated into ritual and ceremony as though prayer might hold back the swords of his enemies. He marched through the streets barefoot with a cross in his hands, chanting psalms while the people mocked him. But his most fatal act came in 1588. The Guise family, too powerful, too arrogant, believed themselves untouchable. Henry III lured Henry of Guise into his chambers at Blois under the guise of reconciliation. There, royal guards fell upon him, stabbing him to death in a storm of daggers. His brother, the Cardinal of Guise, was murdered the next day. The Catholic League erupted in fury. The king had not broken their power. He had declared himself their mortal enemy. Paris rose in rebellion. The League branded Henry III a tyrant. Even the Pope condemned him. The king fled the capital, a monarch in name only, clinging to a dwindling circle of supporters. In his desperation, he turned to his old rival Henry of Navarre. The Catholic king and the Protestant prince forged an uneasy alliance against the League, bound not by faith, but by necessity. But fate had little mercy left for the Valois. In August 1589, while camped near Paris, Henry III was approached by a Dominican friar, Cock Clement, who begged audience to deliver secret letters. Allowed into the royal presence, the friar drew a dagger and plunged it into the king's abdomen. Henry staggered, mortally wounded, and died the next day, whispering his last command, "After me, it is Navarre. He is king. He is the only one who can save France." With Henry III's death, the Valois dynasty was extinguished. Centuries of royal bloodline ended in a whisper of betrayal and a river of blood. The crown passed to Henry of Navarre, who would become Henry IV of France, first of the Bourbon line, Protestant by birth, a Catholic by necessity, and the man who would finally bring peace to a kingdom shattered by decades of religious war. But that is another story, the story of Charles IX. Catherine de' Medici in The Last Valois is the story of a family cursed by power, a mother who ruled through fear and manipulation, a boy king haunted into madness, a brother king strangled by fanaticism. They ruled not a kingdom, but a tyrant in the flames of the wars of religion. The Valois burned to ash. Henry IV, the Bourbon who saved France when the dagger of Jacques Clement ended Henry III's life. France was not merely without a king, it was without a dynasty. The Valois line, which had ruled for centuries, had collapsed in blood and madness. In its place rose a man who had once been the enemy of the crown itself, Henry of Navarre, the Protestant prince who had survived the wedding massacre in Paris 17 years before. But Henry's road to the throne was anything but smooth. The Catholic League, led now by the Guise family and backed by Spain, declared him illegitimate. To them, a Protestant could never wear the crown of France. Paris itself shut its gates against him. The League's banners flew across the capital, its sermons thundered from pulpits, and foreign soldiers poured into French soil in the name of faith. For nearly a decade, France was consumed by civil war. Henry of Navarre fought with courage, charisma, and brilliance. His soldiers adored him, and he proved himself one of the great battlefield commanders of his age. At Ivry in 1590, he led his troops with a white plume in his helmet, crying, "Follow my plume. If you lose sight of it, you lose your king." Against overwhelming odds, he crushed the League's forces. But victory on the battlefield could not deliver Paris. Paris was the heart of France. Paris would not surrender to a Protestant king. Henry knew this truth as well as anyone. For 2 years, he besieged the city, but it resisted, starving rather than yielding. He could win battles endlessly, but never to worn out until he made the one choice that would change France forever. In 1593, Henry announced his conversion to Catholicism. With a wry smile, he is said to have declared, "Paris is well worth a mass." The League raged. Spain fumed. But the people of Paris rejoiced. To them, the kingdom at last had a Catholic king. And in 1594, Henry IV entered Paris not as a conqueror, but as its monarch. What followed was something France had not known in decades: peace. Henry was no saint. He was pragmatic, sometimes ruthless, often unfaithful to his wives. But he was also shrewd enough to know that France's wounds would not heal by sword alone. In 1598, he issued the Edict of Nantes, granting Protestants freedom of worship, equal civil rights, and fortified towns for protection. It was not total equality, but it was survival. It was coexistence. After 36 years of massacre and civil war, France could finally breathe. Henry's reign brought stability, prosperity, and a vision of France as a kingdom where Catholics and Protestants could live, if not as brothers, then at least as neighbors. He repaired roads, restored the economy, encouraged farming, and earned a reputation as a king who cared for his people. To the poor, he became good King Henry, the monarch who promised that every peasant would one day have a chicken in his pot on Sunday. And yet, even peace was fragile. In 1610, as Henry IV prepared for war against Spain, a Catholic fanatic named Francois Ravelic stabbed him to death in his carriage on the streets of Paris. Once again, the dagger ended the reign of a French king. But unlike Charles IX and Henry III, Henry IV left behind more than a corpse. He left behind a dynasty. His son, Louis XIII, inherited the throne, and with him began the long Bourbon line that would carry France into the age of absolutism and empire. The nightmare of the Valois was over. The Bourbon dawn had begun. The story that began with Catherine, de Medici's iron grip, and Charles IX's haunted eyes ended with Henry IV's pragmatism and vision. From massacre to edict, from madness to stability, France clawed its way through 3 decades of blood to finally find peace, not through divine intervention, but through compromise. The lesson of the Valois was written in their downfall. Crowns may be inherited, but kingdoms are sustained only by wisdom. And wisdom, in the end, belonged not to the princes of Valois, but to the heretic who became a Catholic king. The Bourbons and the birth of absolutism, the dagger that killed Henry IV in 1610, did not only end a king's life, it thrust France into yet another uncertain transition. His son, Louis XIII, was only 9 years old, and the kingdom once again found itself ruled by a mother. This time it was Marie de' Medici, Catherine's distant Florentine cousin, who stepped into power as regent. Like Catherine before her, she was cunning, ambitious, and mistrusted. She leaned heavily on foreign favorites, especially the Italian Concini, whose arrogance earned him enemies everywhere. The nobility bristled, factions sharpened their knives, and France seemed poised to slide back into the chaos Henry IV had fought so hard to end. But the boy who would become Louis XIII was not Charles IX. He was not fragile, not haunted, not easily bent. By 1617, at the age of 16, he struck his first blow for independence. His guards stormed Concini in the courtyard of the Louvre and shot him dead. When told his mother's favorite had been killed, Louis answered coldly, "At last I am king." Louis XIII was no solitary ruler. His true strength came from the man who became his chief minister in 1624, Cardinal Armand Jean du Plessis de Richelieu. Richelieu was no ordinary cleric. Thin, hawk-faced, burning with ambition. He saw the monarchy as a fragile sapling in a storm of noble feuds and foreign threats. His mission was simple but relentless: to make the king absolute. Richelieu's iron hand against the nobles. He tore down their private castles, stripped away their fortified privileges, and crushed their rebellions with merciless force. No more would dukes and princes behave as petty kings within the kingdom. France would have only one master, the crown, against the Huguenots. Though Henry IV's Edict of Nantes had guaranteed Protestant rights, Richelieu regarded their fortified towns as a threat to royal authority. In 1627, he besieged the great Protestant stronghold of La Rochelle. After more than a year of starvation, the city fell. The Huguenots retained their faith, but their political and military independence was annihilated. Against foreign powers, France was encircled by the Habsburg dynasty, which ruled Spain and the Holy Roman Empire. Though a cardinal, Richelieu did not hesitate to ally with Protestant princes of Germany to weaken Catholic Habsburg power. France's survival, not Rome's blessing, guided his hand. Through Richelieu's policies, France was transformed. The monarchy ceased to be a fragile crown balanced among rival factions. It became a throne of iron. The king in the shadows, Louis XIII, was no weakling, but he was often overshadowed by his minister. He was austere, deeply Catholic, often melancholic. He trusted few, loved fewer, and carried a sense of cold duty rather than warm charisma. Where Henry IV had charmed Louis XIII in forced, where Catherine had schemed in shadows, Richelieu ruled in daylight, openly and without apology. By the time of Louis's death in 1643, France was no longer the fractured kingdom Charles IX had inherited. It was a rising power, disciplined, centralized, feared. The stage was set for the reign of a child king who would grow into the very symbol of absolutism itself. Louis XIV, the Sun King, with him. The story of France would pass from haunted boy kings and desperate mothers into the age of grandeur, Versailles, and empire, but the shadow of the Valois never fully lifted. Beneath the splendor of the Bourbons lingered the memory of bells tolling in Paris, of brothers turned against brothers, of blood staining the Seine. The price of absolutism had been written in massacre, regicide, and repression. France had survived, but it had not forgotten. The Sun King rises. When Louis XIII died in 1643, France once more found itself with a boy king. His son, Louis XIV, was only 5 years old. But unlike the fragile Valois children who had worn the crown a century earlier, Louis carried the legacy of a kingdom reshaped by Richelieu's iron hand. The regency fell to his mother, Anne of Austria, and her trusted minister, Cardinal Mazarin, Richelieu's successor. For nearly 2 decades, Anne and Mazarin steered the kingdom through storms of rebellion. Most notably, the Fronde series of uprisings by nobles, magistrates, and even Parisians who despised the growing central power of the crown. The boy king never forgot those years. He had once been forced to flee Paris at night, the cries of angry mobs echoing through the streets. That memory, more than any other, forged his destiny. If Charles IX had been broken by Paris, Louis XIV resolved he would break Paris and every rival before they could ever threaten him again. L'état cessé moi when Mazarin died in 1661. Louis XIV stunned the court. He announced he would rule alone, without a first minister. It was unheard of. For generations, France had been guided by strong ministers, Catherine, Richelieu, Mazarin. Now, at 22 years old, Louis declared, "L'état, c'est moi. I am the state." He meant it. Louis XIV embodied absolutism, not as theory, but as spectacle. He centralized power, demanded obedience, and surrounded himself with rituals that elevated his person above all others. He became not just a king, but the Sun King, the radiant center of a universe where every noble, every priest, every subject revolved around his brilliance. Versailles, a palace of power to bind the nobility. He built Versailles, the grandest palace Europe had ever seen. More than a residence, it was a gilded cage. There, nobles vied not for armies or castles, but for the privilege of handing the king his gloves or standing near him as he dressed in the morning. Power no longer lived in private fortresses, was absorbed into ritualized servitude around the throne. The nobility, once dangerous, became ornamental. The crown, once fragile, became unassailable. The wars of the Sun King, but Louis XIV was not content with ceremony. He waged war after war to expand France's frontiers and assert its dominance in Europe. His armies became the most feared on the continent. At his height, he pushed France's borders to the Rhine, made Spain tremble, and cast his gaze even across the seas. Yet his wars drained France's treasury and bled its people. The glitter of Versailles was paid for with taxes that crushed peasants and campaigns that left villages burned and fields barren. The splendor of the Sun King cast long shadows. The faith of a king religion remained central to his vision. Unlike his grandfather, Henry IV, who had made compromise with the Huguenots, Louis XIV had no patience for religious pluralism. In 1685, he revoked the Edict of Nantes, outlawing Protestantism in France. Churches were destroyed, children taken from their parents. Thousands of Huguenots fled into exile. France had traded civil war for persecution. The same kingdom that had once drowned in blood under Charles IX now sought unity through enforced conformity. The lesson of the past had been inverted, where Henry IV had chosen tolerance to save France. Louis XIV chose repression to control it, the long shadow by the time of his death in 1715. Louis XIV had ruled for 72 years, the longest reign of any European monarch in history. He left France magnificent, terrifying, and exhausted. Versailles gleamed. The arts flourished. The crown stood taller than ever before. But the peasants groaned under taxes. Protestants had fled or been broken, and France's enemies gathered to contain the ambitions of the Sun King. Louis XIV was a triumph of absolutism, but he was also its warning. His reign showed the grandeur a king could command, but also the suffering a nation could endure under unchecked power. The Valois had fallen because they could not control their kingdom. The Bourbons rose because they could. In their very success lay the seeds of future catastrophe. For beneath the glitter of Versailles, resentment smoldered, resentment that would one day explode in 1789, sweeping away not just kings, but the very monarchy itself. From Catherine de' Medici's whispered intrigues, through Charles IX's haunted eyes, through Richelieu's iron hand, to the blazing sun of Louis XIV, France's story was one of fire. Fire of faith, fire of ambition, fire of kings. The crown survived the massacre, survived madness, survived rebellion. But in surviving, it became something else, absolute, radiant, and brittle. The Bourbons in decline, from splendor to revolution, when Louis XIV died in 1715. He left behind a kingdom glittering in appearance, but cracked beneath the surface. His wars had drained the treasury, his absolutism had stifled dissent, and his persecution of Protestants had driven some of France's best artisans and merchants into exile. Still, he had ruled so long, and with such force of will, that no one dared openly challenge the system he built. But after the sun set, shadows crept in. Louis XV, the beloved turned despised at just 5 years old, Louis XIV's great-grandson, became king. Louis XV. France again found itself with a boy king and a regency. This time under Philippe d'Orléans. In his youth, Louis XV was adored. Handsome, intelligent, gentle, he was hailed as Louis the Beloved. France hoped he would blend the strength of his great-grandfather with a more merciful hand. For a time, he did. He presided over peace, scientific progress, and prosperity. But Louis XV lacked the burning energy of the Sun King. He shrank from responsibility, withdrew into pleasures, and let mistresses and ministers dominate the court. The most infamous of these was Madame de Pompadour, who wielded enormous influence not only in politics but in the arts, becoming a great patroness of Enlightenment thinkers. Yet while salons in Paris buzzed with new ideas, liberty, equality, reason, the monarchy stagnated. Wars returned, costly and fruitless. The 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, ended in disaster, with France losing nearly all its colonial empire in North America and India. At home, corruption deepened, taxes fell heavily on peasants, while nobles and clergy clung to privilege, and resentment grew. By the end of his reign, Louis XV was no longer beloved. He was despised. When he died in 1774, Paris received the news with indifference, even relief. Louis XVI, the last Bourbon king, the throne passed to his grandson, Louis XVI, a shy and conscientious young man. Unlike his predecessors, Louis XVI sincerely wanted to reform France. He reduced court expenses, eased censorship, and supported America in its struggle for independence, sending fleets and troops that helped defeat Britain at Yorktown. But the price of helping America was staggering. Détente France was already drowning financially. Attempts at tax reform failed, blocked by nobles and parliaments who guarded their privileges. Bread grew scarce, prices soared, and the common people, the Third Estate, grew restless at the same time. The Enlightenment was in full bloom. Philosophers like Voltaire, Rousseau, and Montesquieu denounced tyranny and inequality. Pamphlets and salons spread revolutionary ideas like wildfire. A century earlier, Richelieu and Louis XIV had crushed the nobility. Now the storm rose from below, from the people themselves. In 1789, desperate for money, Louis XVI summoned the Estates General, a gathering of representatives from clergy, nobility, and commoners. What he intended as a negotiation became a revolution. The Third Estate broke away, declared itself the National Assembly, and swore the tennis court oath to write a new constitution. Within weeks, Paris erupted. A Bastille fell on July 14, 1789. The French Revolution had begun. The fall of the Bourbons. Louis XVI hesitated, faltered, and vacillated. He was neither tyrant nor visionary, only a man too weak to ride the storm. As revolution radicalized, he was swept from king to prisoner, from monarch to traitor. In January 1793, on a cold morning in Paris, Louis XVI mounted the scaffold. The blade of the guillotine fell, severing not just his head, but the very idea of divine kingship in France. Months later, his queen, Marie Antoinette, followed him to the same fate. The Bourbon monarchy, built on centuries of blood and absolutism, collapsed in the roar of the crowd and the fall of the blade. Epilogue: from Catherine to the Revolution. The story that began with Catherine de' Medici, weaving her webs of intrigue to keep her sons on the throne, ended with the monarchy itself destroyed. Charles IX, the haunted boy king, lost to madness. Henry III, stabbed by a fanatic. Henry IV, the pragmatic king, assassinated in the street. Louis XIII, overshadowed by Richelieu, who forged absolutism. Louis XIV, the Sun King, who made France great and brittle. Louis XV, who squandered that greatness. Louis XVI, who faced the reckoning none could escape. The crown has survived massacre, fanaticism, civil war, and rebellion. But it could not survive the people's demand for liberty. The Valois had drowned in blood. The Bourbons had bathed in splendor. Both dynasties had believed the monarchy eternal. In 1793, the guillotine proved them wrong. From revolution to empire, the rise of Napoleon, the fall of Louis XVI, was not the end of France's turmoil. It was the beginning of a new storm. The monarchy was gone, but what would replace it? The revolution devoured itself. Became hopes of constitutional monarchy, then the republic, then the reign of terror, when the guillotine claimed nobles, priests, and revolutionaries alike. The Committee of Public Safety, led by Robespierre, ruled France by fear, demanding virtue and delivering executions. Even the shadow of Catherine de' Medici, queen of plots and survival, would have paled before this bloodletting of 1793 to 1794, when the terror ended. France staggered into a new experiment. The Directory 1795-1799. Corrupt, unstable, and mistrusted, it struggled to maintain control. The ideals of the revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity, seemed hollow in the face of hunger, inflation, and endless war against Europe's monarchies. And then, from the army, came a man, Napoleon Bonaparte, the new monarch born in Corsica. Provincial outsider, Napoleon Bonaparte rose through the chaos of the revolution by sheer brilliance. He was a general unlike any France had ever seen. Strategist, motivator, gambler. Victories in Italy made him a hero, and by 1799 turned his ambition against Paris itself. With soldiers at his back, Napoleon overthrew the Directory in the coup of 18 Brumaire. In its place, he established the consulate, naming himself first consul. The Republic still existed on paper, but in truth, France had a new master by 1804. He took the final step, crowning himself Emperor of the French in Notre Dame Cathedral, snatching the crown from the Pope's hands to place it on his own head. No Bourbon, no Valois, no divine right, only his own will. The monarchy had returned, but in a new form. The empire of glory. Napoleon's rule was not the velvet absolutism of Louis XIV, nor the hesitant compromises of Henry IV. It was a machine of war, law, and ambition. The Napoleonic Code. He restructured French law, abolishing feudal privileges once and for all, enshrining property rights, and spreading principles of equality for men, not women, across Europe. Military genius. At Austerlitz, Jena, Wagram, he shattered Europe's old monarchies. Prussia humbled, Austria beaten, Spain occupied. The Holy Roman Empire dissolved, and Napoleon redrew the map of Europe in his image. A new nobility. He created titles for his generals and family. But unlike the Valois or Bourbons, his nobles owed him everything. His empire was built not on ancient bloodlines, but on loyalty and victory. Yet in this triumph lay the old dangers. like Louis XIV, he pushed too far. His invasion of Russia in 1812 ended in disaster. The snow swallowed his grand army, and Europe rose against him. By 1814, Paris fell. Napoleon was exiled. The return and the final fall, but Napoleon was no ordinary man to fade in exile. In 1815, he escaped Elba, landed in France, and marched toward Paris. Soldiers sent to stop him instead joined him, crying "Vive l'Empereur." In the space of weeks, he reclaimed the throne without a battle. The Bourbons, briefly restored, fled once more. The 100 Days had begun. It ended at Waterloo, defeated by the Duke of Wellington and Prussian forces. Napoleon's dream collapsed forever. He was sent to St. Helena, a lonely island in the South Atlantic, where he died in 1821. The Bourbons returned, but changed forever after Napoleon's fall. The Bourbons returned in the form of Louis XVIII, brother of the guillotined Louis XVI. But this was not the old monarchy of Catherine, Richelieu, or Louis XIV. It was a monarchy bound by constitution, shadowed by revolution, haunted by Napoleon's memory. The age of divine kingship was gone. France would never again submit blindly to the idea that the king was the state. The revolution had burned that illusion away, and Napoleon had proven that power now belonged to those bold enough to seize it. Epilogue. From Catherine to Napoleon, the story that began with Catherine de' Medici's whispered plots in the Louvre ended with Napoleon Bonaparte's thunder across Europe. Catherine had fought to preserve the monarchy through intrigue. Charles IX had drowned in his own weakness. Richelieu had built the Iron Crown of absolutism. Louis XIV had turned it into a sun. The Bourbons after him had squandered it. The Revolution had smashed it. Napoleon had rebuilt it in fire and steel. The monarchy Catherine fought to defend was dead. But the idea of France powerful, centralized, defiant lived on. Kings, queens, emperors rose and fell. But the legacy of that century of blood and brilliance endured. France had passed from daggers in the dark to cannon on the battlefield, from shadowed chambers in the Louvre to the golden halls of Versailles, from the cries of "Kill the Huguenots" to the cries of liberty, equality, fraternity. And through it all, the question remained: who rules France, the king, the people, or the man bold enough to claim both? France in the 19th century, from kings to emperors to republic. Napoleon's fall in 1815 left France exhausted, humiliated, and restless. For over 2 decades, the nation had lived in constant war, guided by a single towering figure. The question: return, who would rule France? The 19th century would give many answers, and none would last. The Bourbon Restoration, 1815 to 1830, after Waterloo. The Allies restored the Bourbon dynasty in the form of Louis XVIII, younger brother of Louis XVI. He styled himself a constitutional monarch, granting a charter of 1814. That created a parliament and recognized some revolutionary gains. But the Bourbons were relics of another age. Louis XVIII maneuvered cautiously, balancing between liberals who demanded more freedom and ultra-royalists who dreamed of returning to the old absolutism of Louis XIV. His brother and successor, Charles X, tilted too far backward. He tried to reassert divine right, restore privileges to the church, and muzzled the press. In 1830, Paris erupted in the July Revolution. Barricades rose in the streets, echoing the storming of the Bastille. Charles X fled into exile, the last Bourbon king of France. The July Monarchy, 1830 to 1848. The throne passed not to another Bourbon, but to a cousin, Louis Philippe, Duke of Orleans, known as the Citizen King. He dressed in bourgeois clothes, carried an umbrella instead of a scepter, and promised to rule as a king of the people. At first, he was hailed as a new beginning. But the July Monarchy soon revealed its limits. Though more liberal than the Bourbons, it served mainly the wealthy bourgeoisie, leaving workers and peasants frustrated. Paris grew restless again. Writers like Victor Hugo and Alexandre Dumas glorified liberty and rebellion. While radicals plotted, in 1848, revolution returned. Crowds filled the streets, the monarchy collapsed, and Louis Philippe fled to England. Once again, France declared a republic, the Second Republic, 1848 to 1852. The new republic promised democracy, universal male suffrage, freedom of the press, social reforms. But the gap between promises and reality soon widened. Economic crisis fueled unrest, and the June Days Uprising in 1848 was brutally crushed by the army. In December 1848, France elected its president, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, nephew of the great Napoleon. His name alone carried magic. To peasants, workers, and veterans, he seemed the heir of glory, the man who could restore France's greatness. But Louis Napoleon had no intention of remaining a mere president. The Second Empire, 1852 to 1870, in 1851, when the Constitution barred his re-election, Louis Napoleon staged a coup. The following year, he declared himself Emperor Napoleon III. France, weary of instability, accepted him. Once more, monarchy returned not by Bourbon blood, but by Bonaparte ambition. Napoleon III presided over modernization, new railroads, industry. Paris rebuilt with wide boulevards under Baron Haussmann. For 2 decades, the Second Empire glittered, but beneath the prosperity lay cracks, censorship, secret police, costly foreign adventures. In 1870, Napoleon III declared war on Prussia. It was a catastrophe. His army was crushed at Sedan. He was captured, and Paris declared the empire dead. The Third Republic, 1870-1940. After decades of oscillating between monarchy and empire, France finally embraced republicanism. A Third Republic was born amid siege and civil war, including the bloody Paris Commune of 1871. But it endured. It outlasted monarchist plots, scandals, and crises. It built schools, expanded democracy, and guided France into the modern age. For 70 years, the Republic survived longer than any Bourbon king or Bonaparte emperor since Catherine's time. Epilogue. It's the legacy of the crown from Catherine de Medici's cunning to Napoleon III's ambition. The French crown was reborn, shattered, remade, again and again. The Valois had ruled through intrigue and blood, the Bourbons through absolutism and splendor, the revolutionaries through terror and ideals, the Bonapartes through war and empire. Each thought they had found the answer to France's destiny. Each was proven wrong. In the end, France chose not kings or emperors, but a republican system born of the very revolution that had toppled Louis XVI. Catherine's struggle to preserve monarchy had failed utterly. But the centralized power she and Richelieu helped forge lived on, not in kings, but in the modern French state. The monarchy that had once drowned Paris in blood, that had once dazzled Europe with Versailles, that had once crowned emperors in Notre Dame was gone. But France remained. France in the 20th century, republic, war, and renewal. The 19th century ended with France firmly under the Third Republic. For the first time since Catherine de Medici's day, the monarchy seemed truly gone. Yet France's path was still not one apiece. It would face 2 world wars, occupation, resistance. In rebirth, the Third Republic, in peace and crisis. 1870 to 1914, the Republic was not born strong. Monarchists still dreamed of restoring a king. Radicals plotted socialism, and scandals shook public trust, none more infamous than the Dreyfus affair, which divided France over anti-Semitism, justice, and loyalty. Yet, despite its turbulence, the Third Republic endured. It expanded public education, strengthened democracy, and built an empire overseas in Africa and Asia. By 1914, France was a proud, modern nation, rivaling Britain and Germany. But then came the Great War, the First World War, 1914 to 1918, when Germany invaded Belgium and France in 1914. The Republic rallied. For 4 years, French soldiers fought in the trenches of the Western Front. Verdun, the Somme, Champagne, names etched in blood. Nearly 1.4 million French soldiers died. Yet, in 1918, France stood among the victors. Alsace and Lorraine were returned. The Republic had survived. But the scars, millions dead, towns ruined, veterans embittered would haunt the nation. Between the wars, 1919 to 1939, the 1920s brought recovery and culture. Paris glittered as the capital of art, music, and literature, the age of Picasso, Hemingway, and Josephine Baker. But beneath the glamour, France struggled. Political instability, economic crises, and the growing threat of fascism in Italy and Germany. By the 1930s, France was divided between left-wing Popular Front governments and conservative nationalists. As Hitler rose in Germany, France seemed paralyzed, unable to act decisively. The Second World War, 1939 to 1945. In 1940, disaster struck. Germany invaded, bypassed the Maginot Line, and crushed the French army in weeks. Paris fell, but France was divided. The North occupied by the Nazis, the South ruled by the collaborationist Vichy regime under Marshal Pétain. For the first time since Joan of Arc, France seemed utterly broken, but resistance burned. De Gaulle, an obscure general, fled to London and declared that France has lost a battle, but France has not lost a war. From abroad and in secret networks at home, the resistance fought on. In 1944, Allied troops landed in Normandy. Paris rose in revolt. De Gaulle marched through the Arc de Triomphe, and France was free again. The Fourth Republic, 1946 to 1958. After the war, France rebuilt as a republic once more. But the Fourth Republic was fragile. Parliaments split. Governments rose and fell, and overseas colonies erupted in rebellion. In Indochina, French forces were defeated at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. In Algeria, war raged, dividing France itself. By 1958, the Republic teetered on collapse. The Fifth Republic and de Gaulle, 1958 to 1969, once again. France turned to a strong man, Charles de Gaulle. He rewrote the Constitution, creating the Fifth Republic, which gave sweeping powers to the presidency. Ended the Algerian War, withdrew France from NATO's command, and sought to make France an independent power, neither American nor Soviet. He became a new kind of monarch, not by divine right, not by bloodline, but by the will of the people. His towering figure echoed Richelieu's discipline, Louis XIV's grandeur, and Napoleon's ambition. France, in the late 20th century after de Gaulle, France modernized rapidly. It built nuclear weapons, developed high-speed trains, and forged the European Union. It faced student uprisings in 1968, economic crises in the 1970s, and political battles between left and right. But one truth had become permanent: the monarchy, in all its forms, Valois, Bourbon Bonaparte, was gone. The Republic had survived world wars, occupation, and decolonization. Unlike Catherine de' Medici's world, power no longer flowed from a crown, but from the people. Final epilogue: Catherine's shadow looking back. The arc of French history from Catherine de' Medici to Charles de Gaulle spans 4 centuries of blood and ambition. Catherine ruled by plots and daggers, fighting to preserve monarchy. Richelieu and Louis XIV ruled by iron and splendor, forging absolutism. The Bourbons fell by weakness and excess, undone by revolution. Napoleon ruled by canon and law, creating empire from the ashes. The Republic survived by the will of the people. Tested in fire, Catherine had fought desperately to hold the Valois throne, never knowing that the very monarchy she sacrificed everything for would vanish forever. Yet, in another sense, her legacy endured. The centralized state, the machinery of power, the idea that France was not just a land, but a destiny. France had moved from kings to emperors to presidents. Apathy remained what Catherine and her heirs had always struggled to preserve: a great nation, impossible to destroy, endlessly reborn. Final chapter, from Catherine to the Republic. For centuries of blood and glory, when Catherine de' Medici first stepped into France in the 16th century, she entered a kingdom already fragile, already trembling between faiths, factions, and ambitions. She fought with poison and whispers, with spies and alliances, to keep the monarchy alive. But what began as a desperate defense of a dynasty became a 400-year struggle to decide what France truly was. The arc of power, the age of intrigue. 16th century, Catherine and her sons wove webs of plots in darkened palaces, executing a kingdom fractured by religion. They preserved the crown, but at the price of endless blood. The age of absolutism. 17th century, Richelieu and Louis XIV transformed monarchy into a fortress of power. Versailles shone like the sun, but beneath the gold lay the iron of centralized rule. France became the model of kingship for all of Europe. The age of collapse. 18th century, the Bourbons, heirs of Louis XIV's grandeur, squandered it. Weak kings, costly wars, and blindness to the people's suffering ignited the revolution. The guillotine ended 1,000 years of monarchy in a single blade's fall. The age of empire. 19th century, Napoleon rose from the ashes, crowning himself emperor, conquering Europe, and rewriting law. He revived monarchy by sheer will, but his fall proved no man could hold France by force alone. The age of the Republic. 19th, 20th centuries. Through revolution after revolution, France finally embraced republicanism. It suffered invasion, civil war, and occupation, but each time it rose again, from the trenches of Verdun to the resistance of Paris. The Republic became France's enduring identity. The iron thread, what unites Catherine's poisoned chalices, Richelieu's iron hand, Louis XIV's gilded palaces, Napoleon's cannon, and de Gaulle's defiant speeches. It is the same truth. France endures by transformation. Kings fall, emperors fade, republics collapse and rise again, but the nation survives, always remaking itself from its own ashes. The shadow of Catherine. And what of Catherine de' Medici? That Italian queen who fought so ruthlessly for a dynasty, now long dead. In a sense, she lost. The Valois are gone, the Bourbons dethroned, the crown itself shattered. But in another sense, she won. The centralized state she struggled to preserve outlived all dynasties. The France of the Republic, the nation-state. The centralized authority was built on the foundations she and her successors fought to defend. Her daggers are gone, poisons forgotten, but her shadow lingers in the very idea of France. Cunning, resilient, unyielding, closing from Catherine's Louvre to Louis XIV's Versailles. From the guillotine in the Place de la Révolution to Napoleon's coronation at Notre Dame. From the trenches of Verdun to the liberation of Paris. This is the story of France's crown. A story not of jewels and thrones, but of blood, ambition, and survival. A story where kings and queens sought to rule forever, but where the only true sovereign was always the nation itself. France, today, is no monarchy, no empire, no kingdom of shadows. It is a republic's card. It's proud and eternal. The monarchy is dead. Vive la France. That completes the full saga from Catherine de' Medici to modern France, for centuries in one sweeping story. Would you like me to now create a visual family tree plus timeline with key rulers, revolutions, and empires so you can see the whole arc at a glance?